Hello and welcome back to Questions That Matter. This is the show where we talk about all of the interesting and important questions that all of us at TrustBridge are working on. Now, today we want to shine the light on India's electricity sector, in particular, the fiscal stress that electricity utilities in India go through and the impact this has on the state's fiscal situation. We've all seen the headlines, we've read the news, every election cycle, there are promises of greater and greater subsidies to households on electricity. It seems like every party is trying to outdo the other by promising more and more free units of electricity. But where's the money for all of this coming from? The electricity utilities in the country are under significant fiscal stress because of these unfunded subsidies. And in a recent paper, my colleague Renuka Sane and her co-authors Charmi Mehta, Radhika Pandey and Ajay Shah look at the fiscal situation in the state of Tamil Nadu and how the electricity sector contributes to this. Renuka, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, how do you measure the state of a state's fiscal situation? I can understand how one might do this at a personal level. How much am I earning? How much am I spending? Can I get a loan from someone? What long-term savings do I have? But what are the standard measures when it comes to a state?
Surprisingly quite similar to how you would think about your individual finances, because ultimately it's a question of what is coming in and what is going out and how much debt you have. So there are two important metrics that one looks at. If you want a summary of the fiscal health of a state, the first is interest payment over revenue receipts. So that's, like the definition gives it away, revenue receipts is the revenue that the state is earning, both from tax revenues and non-tax revenues. And interest payments is the money that is flowing out towards interest. So that state incurs debt and then it has to pay interest to service that debt. And out of every 100 rupees it earns as a revenue, the question is how much of it is just going to pay your interest debt, right, or interest payments. And the higher the IP over RR ratio, that's the interest payments over revenue receipts ratio, the worse off you are, because it means that much more of your revenue is going towards just servicing your debt. And the second metric that we often use is the debt to GDP ratio. So, GDP is the GDP of the state. And then how big is the debt as a proportion of the GDP of the state? And here again, the higher the debt to GDP ratio, the worse off you are. And so these are two broad metrics that one might use. There are, of course, others in terms of growth rates of debt, in terms of the interest rate that you are paying. But, if you want a very simple kind of thumb rule type of a metric, it is the IP over RR ratio and the debt to GDP ratio.
Understood. So now let me try and take a very simplistic stance here. We know that the distribution companies are separate standalone entities. They are the ones who need to pay for the electricity they buy from generators and they charge consumers for this electricity. Now, if there is a subsidy, then it is the distribution company's problem. How does this affect the state? How does the electricity sector and subsidies in the electricity sector contribute to the fiscal state of the state as a whole?
Sure. So let me just start with some of the numbers that we found in Tamil Nadu. If you look at Tamil Nadu's IP over RR ratio, it is about 20% in FY23. What is more interesting is that it has deteriorated since 2013 to 2023. So if you looked at the distribution of all states, you found that Tamil Nadu was just above the 25th percentile value of the IP over RR across all states in India. By 2023, it had come to a little higher than the 75th percentile of all states in India. So it's pretty bad.
That's drastic.
That's a huge change in 10 years. Yeah. And similarly, the debt to GDP ratio had reached almost 32% by FY23. Now, just before I even get into the question of electricity, typically you would say, is 32% high, is 32% low. Yeah. Is 20% high, 20% low. So one is, of course, you might want to compare it with the All India numbers. And the All India numbers are much better than the Tamil Nadu numbers. But more importantly, you would want to look at, every state has certain thresholds that their fiscal responsibility management bills have set out that, in this state we will not reach or we will not breach a certain threshold. And in Tamil Nadu, these numbers have been breached or are about to be breached. So it's a pretty bad situation in Tamil Nadu. Now, how do you start thinking about electricity in this? So I said that interest payments is one component of where your revenue receipts go. The other component is the subsidy, because very often there are two ways in which you subsidize electricity. One is that you cross subsidize, so you charge commercial customers much higher and you charge residential customers much lower. But the other is that the gap still between, so the DISCOM purchases electricity from somewhere, there is a cost of that, and it sells electricity to customers and to residential users or to industrial users or whoever. And so this gap between cost and revenue that it earns from these people has to be met by somewhere. And very often the state takes over that burden. So the subsidy is paid from the state to the DISCOM to make up for the revenue that it is not getting because it is subsidizing electricity for its domestic and agricultural users. So that's one way that electricity subsidies play a big role.
And can I just quickly jump in and say that I think it's important also to recognize two facts here, two things that emerge from what you're saying. One, when we say that the distribution company has to buy electricity and pay for it, and then again charge customers for what they sell, it's not as if they have a free hand in that.
Sure.
Power purchase agreements are typically locked in for 20, 25 years. You can't change those prices around at will. You are stuck with what you have promised to pay perhaps tens of years ago. And on the other hand, what you're charging from consumers is also tightly controlled and regulated. So as a distribution company, I can't make a pure profit calculation.
That's true, but the revenues are sort of decided based on some return of equity numbers that you have to propose to the regulator and the regulator has to approve. But second, the other place where you can really cut costs is by reducing wastage. Yes. So transmission losses, for example, count for a big proportion of the cost of supply. And perhaps there are gains to be made there. And it seems that Tamil Nadu's average cost of supply was around 8 rupees per unit, and it seems a little higher. And then one has to dig into why it is that it is 8 rupees and not 6 rupees. And, again, you have to compare with different states and say, why is Gujarat able to get a better deal than Tamil Nadu? And there might be geographical reasons for it. There might be historical reasons for it. There might be these ability of the DISCOM to cap these AT&C losses. So that's, the whole question of how you manage the cost of supply.
And say a little more about the cross-subsidy point. You said that I might charge an industrial consumer more, I might charge lesser amount correspondingly to a domestic consumer. Why is that a problem?
That is a problem. So one is that sometimes the cross-subsidy might still not be enough to make up for the low amounts that you are charging industrial consumers, right? Domestic consumers. And you're pretty much giving free electricity to agriculture. So how much are you going to burden industrial and commercial users to be able to give free electricity to agriculture and some proportion of domestic users? Because say, in many states, up to certain units of electricity is free.
And those consumers will then walk out, the industrial consumers
yes,
will
and
walk
out. So that's one. This is how much can you increase? B, they will walk out. And C, it, when you charge high prices to CNI customers, that's commercial and industrial customers, what it means is that the production costs go up. And so therefore, Indian industry is not competitive. One of the reasons. I mean, there are many reasons why Indian industry is not competitive, but this becomes one more reason. It adds to that. Because then our cost of production is so much higher because we are paying a lot more for electricity, and you might have perverse consequences where people will want to stay as SMEs because then they don't want to pay these different rates for becoming CNI. And so there are all of these downstream consequences, sometimes hidden and sometimes not hidden, that put in inefficiencies in the way that our markets work. But coming back to how does electricity then play a role, right? So we said one is that there is subsidy that is going from the state to the DISCOM, and that subsidy is also part of, like I said, we pay interest payments from the revenue receipts. We will pay these subsidies also from the revenue receipts. So if so much of your money just goes into paying this, what is left for developmental expenditure? So that's one way in which power contributes to the fisc. But the other interesting way that the power contributes to the fisc is the borrowings of the discom. So Tangentco, for example, we know that in FY23 had about 1,50,000 crores on its books as debt. Now this debt has to be repaid.
I think you need to slow down, let that number sink in.
Yes. And so this debt has to be repaid. And technically, this is not the state government's problem. And this does not sit on the state government's books. It sits on Tangentco's books. And Tangentco is a separate entity from the state government. But it is a PSU. It's a public sector undertaking. And if Tangentco begins to fail on its payments, then it is very hard to imagine a scenario where the state government would not come in and repay some of that debt. And so what we do in this paper is we say, let's calculate the debt to GDP ratio of Tamil Nadu without these numbers. And that comes out to be, I think, about 32%. And then say that, okay, what if this were added to the consolidated debt of the state? And then we find that that number, then the debt to GDP ratio really shoots up and it's almost about 39%. So right at the outset, depending on how you calculate the consolidated debt, you see that the debt to GDP ratio is actually worse than what meets the eye, and what met the eye was not particularly great to begin with.
And there was a lot of this that was hidden off budget.
Yes.
Well, hidden may be an exaggerated term, but it was not on budget.
Yes.
But when you do bring it in for the reasons that you mentioned, then it becomes scarily bad, the situation.
And the other thing that we did in this paper is to say, fine, this is the debt to GDP ratio today, but what is it going to be 5 years later, right? And then when you're making these simulations, you have to make certain assumptions about how you think the interest rate is going to be, how you think the growth rate of GDP is going to be. So if, your GDP grows by a lot, then it's easier to handle this. But if you have a lower GDP growth rate, then of course the debt to GDP ratio will look worse. And so we tried different combinations of the interest rate and GDP growth rates. And we found that if you put in this consolidated debt, then by FY28, your debt to GDP ratio is almost 45 or 46%. And that really begins to look very, very scary. So in India, we have had situations where state governments have defaulted on their payments, where state governments have not been able to pay salaries and pensions because they were bankrupt. And we think that if this continues, then Tamil Nadu is hurtling towards that situation. And it's a bit of a surprise because you would think that Tamil Nadu is one of the better states of this country, and it is. And it's one of the more industrialized states. It's a state with very high levels of human capital. And so you don't club it with states that are hurtling towards a fiscal crisis. But with Tamil Nadu, we do see that the power sector has a big contribution to play in its current fiscal situation and what potentially might be. However, I just want to add that in the last year, Tamil Nadu has made some changes. They have increased tariffs. They've got this system where there is a continuous escalation of tariffs. And so we hope that, this realignment of the prices and the tariffs for domestic consumers brings some of these fiscal problems, in check. And we'll also have to see what they do about Tangentco's debt. But that's certainly something that they face.
Right. So it's a worrying diagnosis. It's a scary situation, but part of the prescription to the cure is rationalizing tariffs. And that's something that Tamil Nadu seems to have done. I have no reason at all to say this, but I'm hoping that in part it is because of the work that you and your co-authors and several other people have done in this space. Thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about the paper. Thank you very much for watching. If you're interested in knowing more about the work that Renuka and her co-authors have put in, the link to the paper that we've talked about will be in the description. Thank you for watching this video. Do keep coming back, watching more. And since this is YouTube, I am mandated to say by the laws of YouTube, remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. Hit the bell icon for notifications. Thank you.